We overestimated the value of natural resource wealth in creating enduring, value, rising incomes and so on. And we underestimated the importance of people, humans, human capital. Started out with natural resource wealth and fought over it in many cases. Asia started out with much less natural resource wealth, looked around and said, well, what do we got here? And the answer is a lot of people whom we can educate, and it turns out that has been the basis of sustained growth and rising incomes. The cell phone sort of appeared almost miraculously, relatively unregulated, much lower capital intensity than the old landline systems, and with evolving technology and a lot of entrepreneurial vigor and innovation, managed to deliver these services, data and voice, to a growing fraction of the world's population, including people who are still poor. And so what appeared to be a digital divide appears to be instead a pattern of convergence. And so astonishing things are happening. I mean, you can have banking services on cell phones that people just simply didn't have access to before. You can transfer money between countries at much lower cost. The World Bank did a study of remittances and found that, depending on the size of the remittance, the amount of money collected in fees on the way through was sort of on the order of 10%. I mean, it's just stunning how high these things were. So that's all going away, and it looks like that won't be a barrier to progress in the poorer developing countries. I think of sustainability as sort of actually two slightly separate things. There are growth paths that aren't sustainable essentially because there are barriers that you run into eventually. So a growth path that relies excessively heavily on natural resources and not enough on reinvesting them in things that generate human capital and innovation and the kinds of things that drive growth in the long term is a path that looks good and it's not sustainable. The turning inward in the import substitution paths that have been tried in developing countries. You could call these sort of things, economic unsustainability as opposed to related to natural resources. The American growth pattern with excess consumption and deficient savings based on an asset bubble prior to the crisis would be a kind of economically unsustainable path. We now realize with the benefit of hindsight. There is the natural resources impact on the environment, and energy, water, all kinds of things that I think people normally associate with the word sustainability. And those are going to turn out to be rather important too in the second half of the century of convergence. In fact, I think completing the journey is going to depend probably on making significant progress in sort of lightening up on the claim on sort of natural resources in the growth. I think it's a reasonable guess that the global GDP, which is already pretty big and impactful, is probably going to triple in the next 20 years, something like that. And if that happens, then I think there's a set of serious risks that the impact will be just too large on the old growth model. Now the interesting thing is the Asians, who are going to be the lion's share of that growth quantitatively, have started to realize that this is an issue for them in terms of the sustainability of their own growth paths, let alone whatever the rest of the world does. And so they're already starting to talk about lifestyle changes and embarking on a different growth path. Whether we can sort of economize, incentivize, and eventually innovate our way to a growth path that allows for this much real increase in the size of the global economy, I think remains to be seen. We just don't know at this stage. I'm not particularly pessimistic. I think people confronted with this turned out to be remarkably innovative. Pretty easy to see the first part of that journey just by being kind of more efficient, but the end part I think is pretty hard to see at this point. Well, they are doing that, and they're doing it to access talent. I think that if we and of course it it would be nice if we had a few more Americans also in some of these PhD programs, particularly in the sciences and engineering. But the other students are enormously talented, so we shouldn't regret having them with us. But we would derive a great benefit both in the short run in having them here, and in the longer term in the kind of relationships and networks that are created from being a little more accommodating with respect to allowing them to work and stay in the country.